Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, I've had several recommendations to take a look at Derek Adam Thomas. It's a channel on YouTube with about 30,000 subscribers, and he's got some videos about presidents and vice presidents. And, we haven't talked a lot about the U.S. vice presidents, and I admit that even as much as I know about the U.S. presidents, my knowledge when it comes to many of the vice presidents is pretty lacking. So hoping to learn some things myself along the way here today. We're going to take a look at one interesting fact about all 49 vice presidents. As always, the link is in the description if you want to check it out for yourselves. And again, thank you guys so much for how you've just blown me away with your support for Roaming History. They're up over 2,400 subscribers now from just under 700 a couple of days ago. So you guys are awesome, and I know they're incredibly grateful for the support. And they're fans of this channel too, which I didn't know. So I thought that was cool. All right, let's go ahead and dive into this one today.
John Adams' second cousin was Samuel Adams. Yes, that Samuel Adams. His third cousin was Abigail Adams, who was also his wife. Thomas Jefferson was famously...
Yeah, and that's not a totally uncommon thing for people to marry people they're distantly related to. Great example, of course, is Eleanor Roosevelt, whose maiden name was Roosevelt. She was the niece of Theodore Roosevelt and a distant cousin to Franklin, who she married. And a lot of these presidents are pretty closely related to each other as well.
The primary author of the Declaration of Independence, and died on its 50th anniversary, July 4th, 1826, which happened to be the same day as his predecessor, John Adams, died.
And that's something that gets talked about a lot. And I don't think it was exactly John Adams' last words, but among his last words were Thomas Jefferson survives, which was untrue. Jefferson had died just hours before him. But it is just one of those great ironies in all of history that these two men who were part of the committee who wrote the Declaration of Independence die on its 50th anniversary, both of them.
1826, which happened to be the same day as his predecessor, John Adams, died. Aaron Burr killed founding father and $10 thirst trap Alexander Hamilton in a duel in 1804, and then tried to start his own country.
Yep. Yeah, Aaron Burr gets in trouble for basically what would amount to one of the clearest cases of treason among anybody in our government's history. And by the time he killed Alexander Hamilton, it was already clear he was not going to be Thomas Jefferson's vice president moving forward. So he ran for governor of New York, and that failed. And it was actually during that election for governor of New York that his beef with Hamilton reached the point of a duel. And so he basically just kind of very quietly served out the remainder of his term as vice president, tried to start his own country, and lived another, almost 30 years or so, but never really achieved much of anything of any note after that.
George Clinton was not only the first vice president to die in office, but also the first vice president of the United States to die, period. Elbridge Gerry.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting because he dies before Jefferson, before Adams, before Burr, and he's also the first vice president under the new system for vice president. The first three vice presidents, Adams, Jefferson, and Burr, all became vice president because they came in second in electoral votes. That's how it was at the time. And so you had John Adams, president, Jefferson, vice president, and they ran against each other for the presidency, and Jefferson defeated him in that election. And so it was during Jefferson's administration that they changed how that was done, and we got more of the system we have today with a legit running mate who's running specifically for vice president.
Is the namesake for gerrymandering.
Yep.
While governor of New York, Daniel D. Tompkins personally financed the state's efforts in the War of 1812, but did so mostly on borrowed money that he couldn't pay back.
So interesting thing, early on in our nation's history, many of the presidents are going to be Virginians, right? Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. These guys are all Virginians. Virginia's the biggest state, but we have a lot of vice presidents coming from New York. Aaron Burr's from New York. George Clinton's from New York. Daniel Tompkins is from New York. Virginia and New York were not only two very powerful states, they were very strong when it came to what we know as the Democratic Republicans. And so it was very often important for a Virginia presidential candidate to have a strong New York vice presidential candidate. You couldn't be on the same state, from the same state on the same ticket. So you couldn't have a Virginian running for vice president if the top of the ticket was Virginia.
John C. Calhoun was super
Southerner.
pro-slavery. Martin Van Buren would eventually become the first president to be born a citizen of the United States.
And he's actually a New Yorker himself. He's also the first vice president to not speak English, and only president to speak a different language as his first language. But yeah, there's another Southerner president with a New York vice president.
And was the only president to speak English as a second language. Richard Mentor Johnson is believed to have been the killer of the Shawnee chief Tecumseh. Just 16 years after serving as President of the United States, John Tyler served in the House of Representatives of the Confederate States.
He didn't serve in the House of Representatives of the Confederacy. He was elected to that position, but he actually died before he was able to serve. Died in early 1862. He's also the first vice president to become president because the president died in office, William Henry Harrison, and there was a lot of questions about that. Did he really become president, or was he only acting president, and did they need to have an election? So his ascendancy to the presidency actually helps answer some of those questions.
Of America. George M. Dallas may have been the namesake of Dallas,
New
Texas,
Yorker.
but that's very disputed. Millard
I think he's another New Yorker. Oh, there's Alec Baldwin again.
Fillmore became president after the death of Zachary Taylor,
New York
and
again?
never had his own vice president. William
I want to look this up now because I'm really curious how many vice presidents are from New York. All right, so here you go. Here's an actual map of the birthplaces of all the vice presidents. So while we have a lot of presidents from Ohio, we don't have so many vice presidents. Charles Fairbanks is from Ohio. We've got Thomas Hendricks, and we've got Charles Dawes. But New York, I believe, 8. So we've got James Sherman, Millard Fillmore, Levi Morton, William Wheeler. Actually, Morton's in Vermont, not New York. This is going to be Van Buren, George Clinton, and then go down in here to New York City. Closer to New York City, we're going to have George Clinton there. Aaron Burr, actually from he's born in New Jersey, but he really was from New York. Schuyler Colfax. Interesting.
William R. King couldn't make it to take his oath of office in 1853 because he was in Cuba trying to recover from tuberculosis. A special act of Congress allowed him to take his oath in Cuba, making him the first and to date the only vice president to take the oath of office on foreign soil.
That's really cool, and that's definitely one I didn't know. That's interesting.
He succumbed to the tuberculosis just a month later.
I knew he died.
Immediately after being vice president, John C. Breckinridge became a Confederate general in the Civil War.
So Breckinridge was one of 4 candidates for president in the 1860 election. That's what helped get Abraham Lincoln elected in some ways. You have Breckinridge, you have John Bell, you have Stephen A. Douglas, and you have Abraham Lincoln. And Breckinridge, he does then he's a cousin of Mary Todd Lincoln, and he becomes a Confederate general immediately. Yeah, he leaves office in March of 61 and immediately joins the Confederacy.
Hannibal Hamlin, like his predecessors John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, died on Independence Day. Andrew Johnson's administration finalized the deal with Russia that purchased Alaska for $7.2 million in gold. Schuyler...
Not sure how that's interesting fact as a vice president, though, because he was actually president. He was a tailor, and probably, I think, one of our least educated presidents that we've ever had, or vice presidents for that matter.
Colfax's son, Schuyler Colfax III, is to date the youngest mayor in the history of South Bend, Indiana, just barely edging out 2020 presidential candidate Pete Buttigieg.
Also interesting, but again, not about Schuyler Colfax. Schuyler Colfax is also the Speaker of the House when the 13th Amendment's passed. He's a very prominent character in the movie Lincoln. You have that scene at the end where he decides that he's going to vote on the 13th Amendment, even though the Speaker didn't normally vote. And then they ask him, well, how does Schuyler Colfax vote? And he looks and he kind of indignant. He says, of course. That's Schuyler Colfax.
Henry Wilson's birthday was February 16th, which means he shared a birthday with me. Also, Henry Wilson was not his birth name. His father named him Jeremiah Jones Colbath after a wealthy and childless neighbor in hopes it would convince him to leave him an inheritance.
Interesting. And we have had 2 presidents whose birth names, their last names were different than the name they served as president. Bill Clinton was William Jefferson Blythe. and Gerald Ford was born Leslie Lynch King. Both of them, I think, were named after stepfathers.
He changed his name to Henry Wilson at age 21. In 1873, Congress approved a pay raise for itself, but Congressman and future Vice President William A. Wheeler opposed the so-called Salary Grab Act and refused the pay raise that came with it. Chester A.
And they've since actually passed a constitutional amendment, I think, that any pay raise for Congress that is passed cannot take effect until after there's been a congressional election.
Arthur was the subject of the original birther conspiracy, with political opponents erroneously claiming that he was born in Ireland and not eligible to be president of the United States.
Ireland? Because I know there's questions about whether he was born in Canada, because he was born up in like the very northern part of Vermont, I think. And that may be, but he still could have been born an American citizen if at least one of his parents was an American citizen.
Thomas A. Hendricks is the only vice president, who was never president, to appear on paper currency. Levi P. Morton bought this Washington, D.C. home from Alexander Graham Bell. The building still stands today and is currently the home of the Embassy of Hungary.
Really?
Adlai Stevenson's son, Adlai Stevenson II, unsuccessfully ran for president in both 1952 and 1956. His son, Adlai Stevenson III, was a U.S. Senator from Illinois and unsuccessfully ran for governor of the state in 1982 and 1986. His son, Adlai Stevenson IV, had a son named Adlai Stevenson V.
The lonesome look.
Yeah, so Stevensons are one of those families who are very prominent in politics, but that you don't hear much about because even though they had positions in government, it was more about how they were unsuccessful in reaching the highest office. We have the Taft family from Ohio was very prominent over the years as well. William Howard Taft, yes, but then there have been other members of the Taft family, including his, I think it was his great-grandson was governor of Ohio, not a very popular one at that.
Son, Adlai Stevenson IV, had a son named Adlai Stevenson V.
The lonesome-looking gentleman in the carriage is Garrett Hobart. You've guessed it, he's the vice president.
Garrett Hobart's D.C. residence was referred to as the Little Cream White House, and Hobart yielded so much power, it wasn't uncommon for him to be referred to as the assistant president rather than the vice president. Teddy Roosevelt.
And then he does not serve. I think he died in office. I want to check that. Yeah, he did. He died November 21st of 1899 of heart disease at the age of 55. So that is why you then have Theodore Roosevelt placed on the ticket for McKinley's second term.
Was next, but first, did you know that 98% of people who watch my videos aren't subscribed?
Really?
That means you, and yes, I am speaking.
That is a crazy high number. I mean, I wonder why that is, that so few people are subscribed. Mine runs more like 50-50, which I guess is pretty good. But if you're not subscribed, why not? Get on it.
Speaking specifically to you, Chris. Probably.
Wait, what? What? That's my name! If you didn't know that, that's my name. Okay, that's a little creepy.
They aren't. So now would be a great time to leave a like on the video and subscribe. Anywho, Theodore Roosevelt hated being called Teddy.
Everybody else saw Chris too, right? It's not like it saw your own name. I'm just kidding. I know that's not the case.
Preferred Colonel Roosevelt, and while on safari, his African guides called him Bwana Tumbo, which literally translates to Master Stomach.
That's awesome. Calling him Colonel Roosevelt's not that weird of a thing. It was actually very common for people who served as president to be referred in the years after their presidency by their military rank rather than by president. It's only been in more recent times that we refer to former presidents as president. And even, people like that had other government positions. Alexander Hamilton serves as Secretary of the Treasury, but even after he leaves office, he's not called Secretary Hamilton. He's called General Hamilton because he was a general. Eisenhower was known as General Eisenhower. Grant was known as General Grant after he left office. Very common.
Charles W. Fairbanks is the namesake of Fairbanks, Alaska.
Yep.
James S. Sherman was the first vice president to fly in a plane. Thomas R. Marshall was known for his sense of humor and would tell a story about a man with two sons. The first son was lost at sea. The second son became vice president. Neither son was ever heard from again. I mentioned a few presidents and vice presidents who died on the 4th of July, but Calvin Coolidge was the only one to be born on Independence Day.
That's cool.
Charles G. Dawes composed a well-known song called Melody in A Major in 1912. In 1951, Carl Sigman added lyrics to the melody, and the song became It's All in the Game.
That's cool. Charles Dawes is also, his father was rather famous, Rufus Dawes, very famously commanded a regiment in the Iron Brigade during the Civil War, led a charge at the railroad cut on July 1st at the Battle of Gettysburg.
In 1958, Tommy Edwards' recording of It's All in a Game hit #1 on the American Billboard record chart and stayed there for 6 weeks. Charles Curtis, a member of Call Nation, is to this day the highest-ranking enrolled Native American ever to serve in the federal government. In 1893, John Nance Garner ran for county judge of Uvalde County and was opposed by Mariette Reiner. In 1895, Garner married Mariette Reiner. Henry A. Wallace created a type of hybrid corn called Copper Cross. Harry S. Truman had a play written about his life called Give 'Em Hell, Harry, and during a run of the play in 2017, he was portrayed by his grandson.
That is really, really cool. His own grandson portrayed him. I had no idea. And actually, that brings up an interesting point. And I'm working on some research for this. I had somebody suggest, and I thought this was a really cool idea, for me to do a video on descendants of U.S. presidents who are alive today and what they're doing. Because there's really some very interesting people out there who are direct descendants of presidents, and they get together sometimes, too. I think it's in Missouri somewhere. But I thought that would be a cool video to do, but it's going to take me some time to put that together.
Shame on you! Alban W. Barkley's grandmother was a childhood friend of former Vice President Adlai Stevenson. Richard Nixon was elected president of the Whittier College student body primarily on a platform of supporting on-campus dances. Lyndon Johnson nearly never became
Richard Nixon was like the original Footloose guy. That's cool.
Vice President because in 1955, while acting as Senate Majority Leader, he had a massive heart attack that was, quote, the worst a man could have and still live. While working as a pharmacist, Hubert Humphrey concocted a substitute for Vicks Vapor Rub. Spiro Agnew was only the second vice president ever to resign, and he did so as vice president to the only president ever to resign.
Yeah, some kind of a tax issue that was going on. He was from Maryland and is chosen as vice president. I don't remember the exact details, but he had to resign, and they had just passed an amendment to the Constitution that provided for a way to fill the vacancy of vice president. Previously, if vice president died or left office, you just didn't have a vice president. And for a good bit of history, the Speaker of the House was not next in line. It was actually the President pro tem of the Senate. So that would and that would have actually, in that case, if the President pro tem of the Senate had become president, that would have only been a temporary thing until a special election could be held to replace the to elect a new president. That all changed with the amendment, and then not long after they passed this amendment, Nixon is in a position where he's able to create a new vice president, and so he chooses the House Minority Leader Gerald Ford, who then rises up to be president because Nixon resigns.
Gerald Ford is the only person to be president despite never being elected. He was appointed as Agnew's successor and 8 months later took the top job. Nelson Rockefeller nearly failed the 9th grade due in large part to undiagnosed dyslexia. Walter Mondale ran for president in 1980.
And I believe Nelson Rockefeller is indeed a descendant, like a grandson or a great-grandson of John D. Rockefeller. And that's another very strong political family that continues to get elected to this day. Yeah, so his father was John D. Rockefeller Jr., so he was a grandson of John D. Rockefeller, the oil magnate. And there have been others in this family as well that have had prominent roles. I believe there's a senator from West Virginia here he is, John D. Rockefeller IV, Secretary of State of West Virginia, Governor of West Virginia. He was a senator from West Virginia from 1985 to 2015. Winthrop Rockefeller, Lieutenant Governor of Arkansas for 10 years. Governor of Arkansas, previous to that, I don't know if that's his father. It looks like, that's probably the father of the lieutenant governor, was governor of Arkansas. And then, of course, Nelson Rockefeller was vice president.
1984 and didn't do so hot. he won only the 3 electoral votes from D.C. and the 10 from his home state of Minnesota.
And he very nearly lost Minnesota, too. If you look at the numbers, it was only a couple of thousand votes that he won his home state by. It could have been a clean sweep of all 50 states, and then he might have only gotten D.C.
George H.W. Bush, like his father, Prescott Bush, and his son, George W. Bush, was a member of the Yale cheerleading team. Dan Quayle is best known for being on the receiving end of this Lloyd Bentsen zinger.
Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine.
You're no Jack Kennedy.
Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy.
Yeah, but who won the election?
And the Oscar goes to An Inconvenient Truth.
Al Gore is the only vice president to win an Oscar. While
Yep.
vice president, Dick Cheney accidentally shot his friend and hunting partner, Harry Whittington. Whittington survived, and in a statement after being released from the hospital said,
My family and I are deeply sorry for all that Vice President Cheney and his family have had to go through this past week.
I'm sorry for what he went through for shooting me.
that's right, he apologized to Cheney. Reportedly, while then-Senator from Delaware, Joe Biden, was giving a long-winded speech, then-Senator from Illinois, Barack Obama, wrote in a note to an aide, "Shoot me now."
That is fantastic.
Mike Pence really hated the movie Mulan, calling it mischievous liberal propaganda in a 1999 op-ed. Kamala Harris attended the same high school as singer-songwriter Leonard Cohen, Westmount High School just outside
Really?
of Montreal, a Canadian school that has now produced a United States vice president before producing a Canadian prime minister.
Huh, that's cool. Well, that was very interesting. I learned a lot of things I didn't know there, and I hope you guys enjoyed that as well. Check out his channel. I'll put a link in the description so you can check that out and see a bunch of his other videos as well. We'll be back again soon with some more content. Thanks for watching.